Welcome, everybody. It's Monday, April 27th, and I just decided to put on a short webinar for you regarding the COVID-19 antibody testing. We've been getting a lot of phone calls and emails, inquiries on when is the test going to be available, what does the test actually mean, what is an antibody, what's an antibody test, how is it different from the nasal swab you see people do infectious testing. So I thought we'd just kind of work our way through this and give you a better explanation about antibody testing and its value, okay, and the news that we have as of today. Let's just start with the actual PCR testing. Again, that's the one that you see when people are getting their nose swabbed, and what they're doing is they're taking, hopefully fragments of RNA and DNA. In this case, RNA, because this virus is an RNA strand. And then they put it through a process called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, more specifically RT, or reverse transcriptase PCR. And the only small difference is because it's a RNA virus, the reverse transcriptase converts it back into DNA. And it's the DNA that they then are looking at in the machine. So they take the DNA fragment at this point in the PCR, and what they're doing is they replicate it through a series of cycles, roughly 40 cycles. It's like building scaffolding. And so they can build the DNA fragments on top of each other so that it actually then looks like something they can identify. And that way they can correlate it to maybe where it comes from and more specifically what virus it actually is. Okay, let's just kind of get into more of the antibody stuff. So what exactly is an antibody, right? So we have different types of antibodies: IgAs, IgMs, IgG, IgE, IgD. The I stands for immune, and the G stands for globulin. So it's an immunoglobulin or an immune protein. So we have immunoglobulin A, immune protein A, immunoglobulins M, immunoglobulin G, E, and D. Now, there's not a whole lot understood about D. They're not that important. Okay, but those are the main categories of antibodies. And they do different things, and they respond at different times during the immune system response. So this is your mnemonics, all right? GAMED, gained. So let's just run through it. Your IgGs, immunoglobulin G, is the most abundant type of antibodies found in all the body fluids and protects against bacterial and viral infections. Your IgA is found in high concentrations in the mucosal membrane, particularly those lining the respiratory passages in the gastrointestinal tract, as well as in saliva and tears. So your IgA is what's found in that mucosal layer. Remember, I've said that the sinuses, the sinus cavity, your bronchioles, your lungs, your entire GI tract, and your bladder is a hollow cavity. When we eat food, when we drink fluids, we breathe in air. As microbes come in, viruses, bacteria, right? The mucosal lining is a barrier to the outside world. And so we have very specialized immune cells in there, such as the IgA cells. So that's your frontline defense, kind of acting as like border control. Your IgM is found mainly in blood and lymph. Right? It's the first antibody to be made in the body to fight new infection. So it's the first antibody in response to as it penetrates through. So the IgA and the IgMs are going to be very early on in an immune system reaction. The IgA is a little bit later. IgE is associated more with allergic reactions. Okay, that's when the immune system overreacts to environmental antigens such as pollen or pet dander. Or if someone has a peanut allergy, they eat the peanut within seconds, they're having a major flare. That's your IgE reactions. And again, very little is understood about the antibody IgD. So for our purposes with COVID-19, the IgDs and the IgAs are not relevant. These are the players, IgG, A, and Ms, that are the players when it comes to antibody testing for COVID-19. Okay, now we're going to look at is just a diagram of entry point. So these are called epithelial cells. The lining of this barrier system are epithelial cells. Your respiratory pathways, your GI pathways, epithelial cells. So on the lining of that is that mucosal layer that you see here. There's an outer mucosal layer and then an inner mucosal layer. That's where mucus is produced, right? So these are your coronaviruses. So if we have proper IgA antibodies, strong, robust IgA antibodies, they can start binding to these viruses and prevent them from penetrating in. If we start having a deficiency or these antibodies are overwhelmed, right, we can start getting some penetration of the viruses into the epithelial cells. Then, of course, if we have insufficient IgAs, the IgA system is just taxed, mucosal barrier is weak, then what's going to happen is that we're going to get much more of these viruses penetrating in and infecting the cell, and eventually the cell is going to be destroyed, they burst out and they infect other cells. So we definitely want to have a robust mucosal immune response. The good news is that can be tested very easily through saliva testing. We'll get into that a little bit later. So let's take a look now at the different timing of antibodies. So now regarding the IgM and IgGs, right? The IgA is your front line. So let's say the infection gets past that and now we're having a response. So what you see here is your window of time over days. So roughly the first 5 days, the patient is asymptomatic. Okay. The infection is kind of taking off, the patient is asymptomatic. After day 5, this is give or take a few days, but after day 5, the patient begins to have an onset of symptoms. So in that time frame, around day 7 is when the IgM antibodies kick into gear. They start to drive somewhere around days 10, and they kind of peak around day 14, and then they start to close down again, and they end around day 21. So you can see that the IgM is an early onset antibody, early in the phase of infection, and it just kind of rides with the coaster of the symptom expression itself. So it's really a short-lived antibody. Initial onset, and then it subsides with the patient recovering. So the patient is striding up along with the IgMs, the patient begins to recover, and we have a decline around day 28. Around day 14, though, is when you start to see the IgG production begin. So the IgG is starting to take off in day 14. So the patient is mostly kind of getting into a recovery phase when the IgG begins. So it's a later antibody response. And it kind of peaks somewhere around days 25, 26, 27, somewhere around there. And then slowly kind of drops. And then hopefully it'll have some sustained longevity. Now, the thing about the COVID-19 virus is that people have asked, if I get the antibodies, if I had the infection and now I have an immune response, is it permanent or is it long-term? And they don't know. They don't know. Well, what they can do is they can compare it. So back in 2003 was the SARS-CoV-1. And in that particular one, 2003, the IgM antibodies are still lingering around some 15 years later. So if it follows the same path, and that was a coronavirus, we're hopeful that the IgG antibody response to COVID-19 will carry the same trajectory and give us longer-term immunity. So that's what we're really hoping for. But just so you can see the onset of the infection, early onset of IgM, and then the IgG. So just before I get too far, you would think if we have an IgM antibody, a positive, we are suspect of some early onset staging of the infection. IgG is going to be a little bit of a later stage. Okay. This diagram is just kind of now looking at the IgAs that we talked about, which is the front line in the barrier system. So they're going to take off very, very early on. And the invasion of anything come into the environment, the IgAs are going to increase. So it's hard to look at IgAs strictly in the terms of COVID because your IgAs can be elevated from anything entering the environment. That includes food, proteins, bacterial, air pollutants, right? So it's very hard to make the IgA specific to the COVID-19. However, it is helpful also in understanding maybe the potential of where a person is in the inflammatory cascade. So you can see here in this diagram that the IgAs and the IgM, right, kind of follow that same trajectory. So their time frame is about the same, but the IgG start later and sustain for a longer period of time. So ultimately, the IgG is going to be the antibody of most importance for long-term immunity. and whether we can get back into going about our business again in society, we can get back to business. This diagram is a little antiquated in the sense that it's asking, is it better to measure total IgM and IgGs versus more specific viral proteins like spike proteins and nucleotide proteins? I know that's fancy language, but this is saying no, but the new evidence is saying clearly yes, that making the antibodies IgM and IgGs even more specific to the spike proteins on the virus that you see, and the nucleotides are more impactful. So let's take a walk through this graph so we understand better what the clinical significance is. Right, IgG and IgG antibodies rise and fall at different times. The relationship between the two antibodies provides information about when the exposure took place, where the patient is in the recovery process, and the presence of protective IgG antibodies. So you see as we go through this is why, really both tests are important because they can validate each other. So if we see here, if a person was able to have a PCR testing and it comes back positive, and they have an antibody test and the IgMs and the IgGs are negative, that would probably indicate that the patient may be in the window period of infection very, very early on, right? They would be somewhere in here. If a patient had the PCR testing and the antibody test is positive for the IgM and negative for IgG, patient may be in the early stages of infection, right? The IgMs are going up, but the IgGs have not kicked into gear yet. Person is positive on the PCR, positive for IgM, and positive for IgG. All right, well, it's going to say that the patient's a little bit past the initial phase, and it's maybe more in the active phase of the infection. Okay, because they still have an early onset, but they're now starting to kick into the IgGs, so somewhere probably around day 14. PCR testing is positive, the IgM is negative, but the IgG is positive. Patient may be in the late or recurrent stage of the infection. What does that mean? Well, there are some people that are being tested that were infected, got over it, and are getting reinfected. Now, does that mean that the IgG response is not long-term? It doesn't mean that. It could possibly mean that that person's immune system is just more compromised and they're not having a robust antibody or immunological response. It's too weak and they're more susceptible. Now you have the possibilities of the PCR testing is negative, but the IgM test came back positive and the IgG is negative. What would that mean? Well, the patient may be in the early stage of the infection, IgM is up, early phase, and the PCR testing may be a false negative, unreliable. So that's why the antibody test can also be a good adjunct to the PCR test. But let's say the person didn't have a PCR test, and this comes back positive and negative. Well, we may be still suspect that the person is in the early stage without the PCR testing. Negative PCR testing, well, they didn't get the PCR testing and the IgM is negative, but the IgG is positive. Patient may have had a past infection and has now recovered. That's ideal. That's what we want. If my antibody test comes back, this is what I want to see right here. I want to know that I had the infection, maybe I didn't have the symptoms, or they were mild symptoms at best, and now I have proof that I'm past the early stage and I'm into the latent, IgG stage, and now I'm moving forward with long-term immunity. That would be ideal. I'm suspect that's going to be a lot of people, because so many people, had mild symptoms. Negative PCR, IgM is positive, and the IgG is positive. Again, patient may be in the recovery stage of the infection, and the PCR testing may have been falsely negative. So these are kind of your clinical significance. So you do see how both the antibody test does add validation to the PCR testing, and for so many of us at this point where we haven't had PCR testing, the antibody test still gives a parameter to where we are in the possibility of infections. Early stage infections, late stage, having good, now going forward with immunity, or maybe in just the active phase. All right, this slide I think is also very helpful because now we're going to talk about why do so many people get exposed to this virus, and some people don't get infected or have mild infections, and some get really serious infections. Right, no infection, mild to serious. All right, this is really, I think, empowering. Right, so a person gets infected, and we have what are called exposomes. Exposomes is referring to your lifetime, your lifetime development of environmental toxins. This is your lifestyle, your dietary habits, exercise, sleep, just all the things that we talk about. Just lifestyle stuff accumulating over an entire lifetime. So a person who has good lifestyle, good diet, takes appropriate nutritional supplements, stress modulation, regulates their blood sugars, isn't exposed to a lot of environmental chemicals and pollutants, they're going to have either no or very mild infections. If a person has poor lifestyle choices, a lot of inflammation, blood sugar problems, leaky barrier systems, yeast infections, they're going to have the tendency for more serious infections. Mucosal immunity, again, that's your barrier system. So how intact is the barrier system? How robust is that IgA component that prevents viruses from even getting in? Because we're hearing about viral loads, and people who work on the front line who are being exposed to this day in, day out, the viral load may be a lot heavier than some other people aren't getting a heavier load. But that load is still impacted by the mucosal immunity. So if a person has an intact mucosal immunity, viral load will be less. If the mucosal immunity isn't so robust, their viral load will be heavier. So a robust mucosal immunity, little to no infection, poor mucosal immunity, more serious infections. Again, these things we have control over. Neutralizing antibodies. And this is going to happen by good immune responses, so taking appropriate supplements that supports the immune system, and it's still controlling inflammatory triggers like blood sugar and yeast overgrowths. All of those things that can help support our immune system is going to allow our immune system to work more effectively. If we don't have that control, we're going to be more susceptible to serious infections. Viral receptors, we won't talk about that because that's getting into more of the genetic component. So we're not going to put a lot of attention to that. Your innate immune response, your inherent response, and we have some ways to regulate that. And we can certainly take nutrients to support our innate response, certain things like mushroom extracts like reishi mushrooms and immunoglobulins like proline-rich polypeptides from colostrum, really, really important. These things will help to mitigate or have low to mild infections. And if we don't have an appropriate innate response, we're going to have serious infections. And then anti-inflammatory cytokines. We've heard about the cytokine storm. So we need the anti-inflammatory immune response to calm down those cytokines. So a lot of people have imbalance here. They can't control that. It's immune modulation. But these things, we can work with this. We can balance the immune system by taking the appropriate nutrients. We spoke a lot about glutathione and vitamin C and things like resveratrol. All of these things help balance the immune system and control the anti-inflammatory response. They can support us in having little to no infection or mild symptoms. If we don't have this balance, we'll be prone to more serious infections. So the good news here is that the reality is that all of these systems, right, are under our control to a lot of degree. Proper testing, proper intervention, proper choices dietary-wise, and taking the right products to support our balanced immune system can make a huge difference between whether we get infected, and if so, how severe or mild is that infection going to be. So that's pretty good news we can be. And this is not just for this virus, this is for the viruses in the future, whether this virus reappears again in the fall, which I'm sure it's going to, or the winter, or new viruses come in, they're going to be there. So, we can do things about this to lessen the infection overall load and also mitigate the severity of the infection. So again, supportive nutrients, it does talk about the COVID-19 and cytokine storm, and what does it do? It increases oxidative stress, which is rusting. So our cells, these lung cells, become oxidatively stressed, so does the blood vessels. Antioxidants, pretty clear, glutathione, selenium, vitamin C and E, curcumins, melatonin, all antioxidant supports, providing mitochondrial cofactors. Again, mitochondria is the engine the power plant in your cells that make energy. It has been shown that the viruses, as they replicate, are hijacking the mitochondria, creating mitochondrial damage. So anything we can do to support that mitochondria will slow down the replication. So here's your zinc, your vitamins A, D, and B complexes. And certainly testing for pathogen resistance, a urinary organic acid test is a wonderful test to look at the overall strength of your mitochondria, to look at nutritional deficiencies, just a lot of information on an organic acid test. So what about the specific COVID-19 antibody testing? Well, yes, test kits are expected to be available starting today, April 27th. Now here's the thing, information over the course of the day has changed. So literally about 15 minutes before I put this presentation together, I got a phone call from the representative from our lab. So there's two ways to do it, which is a blood draw or a dried blood spot. Early this morning, the dried blood spot was available. The lab is still waiting for FDA approval. That being said, the dried blood spot is going to have to be performed at our office. These tests were originally designed to be shipped directly to the patient. That is no longer going to be the case. They are going to be, at this time, shipped directly to the office. And so this morning, we were getting set up to have these tests get ready to get shipped to our office. That's a lot for us to do. We have to enter your information into a portal, and tests with your name are designated on, and then will be shipped to our office. 15 minutes ago, we got a phone call back from the rep that they're going to put the dried blood spot on hold temporarily because they want to get the FDA approval on this test. A lot of other labs are rushing to get dried blood spot tests out without FDA approval. This lab wants the credibility, and that's important because we want these tests not just for now, but for the long haul. So, getting the FDA approval for this is going to create more significant credibility to the value of the test. That said, as we speak now, the blood draw is available. But you have to, since we do not draw blood in our office, you would have to use a phlebotomist if you go through us. And so we've made arrangements with a phlebotomist in Englewood, New Jersey. Okay. The best way if you're interested is to reach out to us through the email, because if you're calling us, we'll get inundated with phone calls, and it's going to be impossible to catch up on all those phone calls right away. I know you'll be waiting for those phone calls, so it's easier to send the emails, and then we can kind of reach back out to you, maybe with an email blast with what the requirements are going to be, what's expected of you, and how we have to set that up. Okay, but we're here to work with you on that if you are interested. Functional lab tests that you might want to consider doing in conjunction with the COVID-19 antibody test, right? So again, we spoke about the salivary, the secretory IgA, your barrier system. We can also do that with an adrenal profile to look at how well the adrenal glands are functioning. So this is easy to do. This you can do in the comfort of your home. The IgA test, again, looking at your mucosal barrier. So that's a good marker to look at. It kind of coincides again with that IgM antibody. But it's well worth it in its own right too, because it also just shows how robust the mucosal barrier is. And if you have let's say you did the antibody test and it's negative and you were never infected, and you do a salivary IgA test and we see that it's very low, then you know that your mucosal barrier is pretty weak. And then if you do get exposure, you will become infected. So it would be more proactive to see this and then start taking and doing the right things to improve that barrier system. The mucosal immune reactivity screen through a company called Severity Laboratories runs the secretory IgA and then some. It's a more expansive test. It also looks to see if we have a leaky gut. That's pretty important to know. Also, if you haven't been infected, you might get infected, because if you have a leaky gut, then the viral load will be much higher than if your gut barrier is intact. So again, kind of good to see that and know that, so that you can take deliberate action steps. And even think about this going forward to probably the next surge of the coronavirus. Organic acid testing is a urinary test. It's a wonderful test. Here again, we look at markers like oxidative stress, so we can be more specific on nutritional needs, gut infections, ruling out infections in the gut, which weakens your immune system, nutritional deficiencies, and more. So it's a wonderful test. Lastly, we want to thank you for spending a few minutes going through this. I hope it's been helpful in clarifying what antibodies are, about the testing and the variations in functional lab testing, and how you can coordinate all this for your health needs. For any of you that are watching this who are not patients, haven't been in our office in a long time, you can schedule a free 15-minute discovery call to find out how you can benefit from these tests or qualify if you're interested in one of our health programs. We're kind of excited because now that we're moving a little bit into virtual telemedicine, we believe that it's going to be the future. We still plan on having our office, a brick and mortar office, but also offering telemedicine and virtual like we're doing today is quite helpful for a lot of people. And we're going to be creating some online group classes. There's been a lot of interest in that. People have been asking, and it's kind of like, why not? I think it'd be kind of a fun idea to help get a group of people together on certain subject matters. And so we'll have topics like adrenal overdrive, Gold Star immunity, how to really boost your immune system, and lung health and mucosal immune rebounder, just to get started. We're certainly open to suggestions. If you guys have some ideas of the kind of classes that you'd like us to create for you, let us know. Again, you can reach out to us through email, which is a great way to do that. And I hope this has been helpful. Okay, sharing the information with you as new information comes along, and it's changing all the time. Rest assured, we'll get that to you. Okay, we'll talk soon.